I recently painted some beetles in watercolour and I've got lots to share with you today. I used graphite to draw in the cast shadows. I glazed Daniel Smith luminescent colour over the top of one of them to create a sheen. I worked wet on wet and wet on dry, and I tried out some new brushes that I want to show you. I've got heaps to share. When I set out to paint these beetles, I thought I'd paint them on the one sheet of paper, but I'd cut it in two when I was finished so that I'd have two separate paintings. Towards the end of the painting, I dropped my brush loaded with black paint and I marked the paper and I couldn't get it off. To fix that, I painted an ant where the mark was, and I quite liked it when I'd finished painting it, so I painted two more. Then the two planned separate paintings became one. I painted this for my beginner watercolour painters on Patreon, so I'll be making a full-length tutorial for them as soon as I can. There's a link to my Patreon site in the description of this video. I used some new brushes for this painting. These are Polina bright brushes. They're synthetic and they're handmade in Germany, and they have a really fine point on them, and I found that they hold a lot of paint and water, which is good. I used a size 0 for this painting, and also this little rigger brush. I enjoyed painting with them. They felt quite comfortable in my hand. Normally it takes me a little while to get used to a new brush, but these felt familiar straight away. I have a link for the brushes in the description of this video if you'd like to take a closer look at them. If you use the link to buy some, you'll get 10% off. The paper I used was Fabriano Artistico Soft Press, which has a fine tooth. The texture of this paper sits in between cold press and hot press. It's not as smooth as hot press, and it's not as textured as cold press. And it was ideal for this painting because I used some graphite and also a watercolour pencil on one of the beetles. And the texture of the paper lends itself to the use of pencils. I find it easier to paint on than hot press paper. I used 3 different reference photos. 2 I downloaded from Pixabay. The photo of the green beetle was taken by Alexander Lesnitsky, and the ants were taken by Image Party. The blue beetle I downloaded from Unsplash, and it was taken by Eric Kuritz. The first beetle is shiny with lots of indentations on the body, so to paint those lighter areas I used some masking fluid. I've got an old liner brush and I'm painting it on wherever I think I need to reserve the white of the paper. I use an old brush because masking fluid can ruin your brushes if it dries in it. When the masking fluid dried, I painted a pale wash of French ultramarine onto the dry paper. I waited until that layer of paint was dry, and then I painted on some more masking fluid. I wanted to darken the body with another layer of paint, but I wanted some lighter indentations to show through. I thought the first marks that I painted on with the masking fluid would be white, and these marks that I'm painting on now would have that pale blue wash on them. For this second layer of paint, I'll work on wet paper. I want to leave some areas of this paler wash showing, and I don't want hard edges showing. Painting on the wet paper allows me to easily leave areas of the lighter paint showing through. I'm still using French ultramarine, but I'm using more pigment this time, less water mixed into it. And I paint that darker colour onto the wet paper. I painted one side of the body first, I let that dry, and then I painted the other side. Here I've left the lighter colour showing around the outer edge. Then I mixed some black paint into the French ultramarine and I dabbed that on there while it was still wet. I dried it and then I painted in the other side the same way, and now I'm removing the masking fluid. I used lamp black on the black areas. I didn't bother mixing black. I didn't think that it was necessary for this painting. I thinned it with water to make it lighter for this first layer. I'll use darker pigment on the next layer, but I'll leave some areas with this lighter colour showing. I used the larger of the two brushes, the mop brush, for as much as I could. By holding it right up on the tip, I can paint fine lines with it. It's got a really fine point on it. Using this brush is quicker than trying to paint those fine areas with the rigger brush. Then when that was dry, I got some more black, this time with more pigment, less water, and I started to darken these areas. Where I wanted it a bit lighter, I took the paint out of my brush and just used a damp brush to spread the paint out. Here I want it to be a bit lighter, so I use the brush to suck some of the paint off. Still using this big brush rather than the rigger brush. Take the paint out of my brush. Smooth over the paint to get a lighter edge on that top side. And as I said earlier, I leave some of the lighter underwash showing in a few places. When it dried, I took the masking fluid off with my rubber cement pickup tool. Then I used my mechanical pencil to tidy things up. And I continued on with the legs with the black paint over the top of the lighter black paint, just on dry paper. Rather than paint the cast shadows in, I decided to use a graphite pencil. This is an 8B, so it's fairly soft. I scribbled some of it onto another piece of paper. I wanted it fairly dark. And then I used a paper stump to rub the graphite onto the paper. So I picked the graphite up with the stump. And then I gently rubbed that onto the paper where the shadows were. I wanted the shadows to have really soft edges, and this was easier and more effective than trying to paint them on. And the shadow helped to lift the beetle off the paper and made it look a bit more three-dimensional. Just a gentle rub. I'm not damaging the paper at all. And I only need a small amount of graphite. I've got my white Prismacolor watercolour pencil here. I'm going to use it to draw on a few extra highlights just on the dry paper, and I won't be activating it. I can add a few more little indentations on the shell. Some areas I wanted a bit darker, so I came back over the top with another layer of the black paint on the dry paper. After I painted the other beetle in, I came back to this one and I painted a layer of Daniel Smith's Duochrome Turquoise over the top to give it a bit of a sheen. I'll show you that later on. Moving on to the green beetle now, I mixed some French ultramarine with transparent yellow and I washed that onto the body. I dried it and now I'm wetting the top section with some water. I picked up some burnt sienna with my brush. I'm wetting it with my brush here. And I painted that onto the wet paper. I left some of the green underwash showing around the edges. Then I pulled some of my green mixture away from the main puddle and I mixed a little black into it. And then I used that to darken some of the top section. I want to see 3 colours here, the green underwash, the burnt sienna, and then this darker colour. While that dried, I started to paint in the legs on dry paper with some black. It's watered down slightly. I don't want it too dark just yet. I'll be painting over the top of it later with more pigment. I kept using the larger brush to paint the legs on. I could have switched down to the smaller rigger brush, but it's much quicker to put the paint on with this larger brush because it holds more paint. All the legs were washed in at this stage. Then I went back to the body. I wet the left side so that I could start to add some detail. And then while the paper's wet, I painted some of that black and green mixture that I had. That's what I used on the top section. I still want to see some of the green. I don't want to completely cover it with this colour. The paint bleeds over the paper because the paper's wet. Then I picked up some burnt sienna. I painted that on there. It's still wet. Then I switched to my little rigger brush and I got some black paint. I used it fairly thick. I wanted to paint it around the edge. I didn't want it to bleed in too far and I didn't want to lose control of it. So that's why I've got thicker pigment now. All I did was wipe the wet brush over the dry pigment. You can see how dark that is. It's still giving me the soft edges that I want, but it's not spreading out of control. All I do is keep wiping my brush over the pigment to pick up more paint. And then I've got to get it on there before the paper starts to dry. When the left side was dry, I did the same thing on this other side. I wet it with water first, I put some burnt sienna on there, and now I'm using the black. I painted over the legs with some darker pigment, but I left some of the lighter colour showing. Then I wanted a really bright green to paint on the body, so I got out the brightest green that I have. This is Daniel Smith's Phthalo Yellow Green. And I painted that over the top of the green areas in a few places on the dry paper. To add a shimmer to the blue beetle, I got out some Daniel Smith's Duochrome Turquoise. This is a luminescent colour that creates an iridescent sheen on the paper. I mixed a little bit of water with it. And I painted that over the top on the dry paper. I didn't paint it all over, just in a few places. That gives it a shimmer. The light hits the paint and it bounces back. I don't use these colours often, but they're great for things like this. You could also use them on some fish or a butterfly or a bird. Anywhere where you want a bit of shimmer. I went back to the green beetle and I used the paper stump and the graphite to draw on the cast shadow. As I said, that helped to lift the beetles off the paper and make them look less flat. As I mentioned, I dropped my brush on the paper with some black paint on it. I tried to remove it, but I could still see it and it was annoying me. So I drew a little ant in that spot and I decided to paint that on there. I mixed a little French ultramarine into burnt sienna and I painted that on there on the dry paper with the mop brush. Then I switched to the rigger brush to paint on the antenna and the legs. I ended up getting a bit of the green that I used on the green beetle and I painted that on the legs as well. Then I got my black. The body was still wet, so I used the rigger brush to run around the edges and create a few shadows. I did the same thing with the paper stump and the graphite and I created a little cast shadow underneath it. Then I added 2 more ants and I decided to keep it as one painting and not cut it into 2 like I had first planned. I hope that was useful to you. Thank you for watching the video. Let me know in the comments if you've used Daniel Smith's Duochrome watercolour paints before and what you use them for. I'd love to get some new ideas about how to use it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel and I'll see you soon. So I'll be making a full-length tutorial, but I cut... How can it be sticking out again by itself? When I set out to paint these beetles, when I sent out to paint the beetles, is my hair sticking up again? Where?